What if I told you that one of Hollywood's most iconic voices fell silent when he walked through the doors of St. Catherine's Orphanage? Morgan Freeman, the man who narrated God's role, came face to face with a 10-year-old boy clutching a worn journal who hadn't spoken a word in 3 years. No cameras, no publicity, just an unexpected visit that would change both their lives forever. The boy's journal held a secret so powerful it brought the legendary actor to his knees. What happened next left even Father Thomas, who'd served the orphanage for 40 years, questioning everything he believed about fate. How did a chance encounter between an Oscar winner and a silent child lead to a miracle that transformed not just one life, but an entire community? The answer will leave you speechless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The old iron gates of St. Mary's, home for children, creaked open, their weathered hinges protesting against the humid Mississippi air. The sound echoed across the sprawling grounds, where scattered leaves danced in the autumn breeze, carrying whispers of stories untold. Who would have thought that on this ordinary Tuesday morning, fate would orchestrate a reunion that would change the lives of everyone within those brick walls? Morgan Freeman stood at the entrance, his familiar warm eyes taking in the scene before him. The once pristine white columns of the Victorian mansion now bore the patina of time, their paint peeling like old memories trying to break free. 50 years had passed since he last walked these grounds as a visitor, bringing books and hope to the children who, like him, once called this place home. The overwhelming sense of déjà vu nearly stopped him in his tracks, but something else caught his attention. The sound of children's laughter floating from somewhere behind the building. Inside, Miss Lorraine Whitaker was attempting to maintain order during breakfast, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun that seemed to defy the chaos around her. 10-year-old Elijah Carter sat quietly at the corner table, his journal clutched protectively against his chest while he observed his surroundings with careful eyes. Unlike the other children, who chattered and squabbled over the last pieces of toast, Elijah found solace in his silent observations, filling pages with words that he shared with no one. Sarah and Daniel, inseparable despite their 4-year age difference, occupied the seats nearest to Miss Lorraine. Daniel, at 12, had appointed himself Sarah's unofficial guardian, making sure his 8-year-old companion always had enough to eat and someone to talk to. Their bond went beyond friendship. It was the kind of connection that only those who shared the weight of loss could understand. Father Thomas Bennett watched the morning unfold from his usual spot near the window, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had seen better days. He was the first to notice the distinguished figure approaching the front door, and for a moment he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. Could it really be the same Morgan Freeman who used to visit all those years ago? The same young man who would spend hours reading to the children and sharing stories of hope and possibility. The atmosphere in the dining room shifted as Morgan's presence filled the doorway. Miss Lorraine froze mid-sentence, her hand suspended in the air as she was about to reprimand 2 squabbling children. The children, sensing the change, fell into an unusual silence. Elijah's pen stopped moving across the page, his eyes drawn to the stranger who somehow didn't feel like a stranger at all. Father Thomas set down his coffee mug and stepped forward, his face breaking into a warm smile of recognition. The years seemed to melt away as he extended his hand to the man who had once brought so much joy to this very room. Morgan's firm handshake carried the weight of shared memories and unspoken understanding. Miss Lorraine's initial surprise gave way to cautious optimism. She had heard stories about Morgan Freeman's visits from Father Thomas, but seeing him in person stirred something deep within her, a glimmer of hope that perhaps this unexpected return could breathe new life into St. Mary's. The children needed more than just shelter and meals. They needed someone who understood their journey, someone who could show them that their current circumstances didn't define their future. Elijah watched the interaction with growing curiosity, his pen hovering above the blank page in his journal. There was something about Morgan that drew him in. Perhaps it was the gentle authority in his voice or the way his eyes seemed to hold countless stories waiting to be told. For the first time in months, Elijah felt an urge to share his own words with someone who might understand them. Sarah tugged at Daniel's sleeve, whispering questions about the new visitor. Daniel maintained his protective stance but couldn't hide his own interest in the man who had commanded such immediate respect from both Father Thomas and Miss Lorraine. The siblings exchanged knowing looks, sensing that their daily routine at St. Mary's was about to change in ways they couldn't yet imagine. As Morgan surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on each face, he recognized the same hope, fear, and resilience he had witnessed in children decades ago. The building might have aged, the paint might have faded, but the heart of St. Mary's, the spirit of its young residents and dedicated guardians, remained unchanged. What secrets and stories would these walls reveal? What wounds needed healing, and what dreams waited to take flight? The morning sun streamed through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. In that moment, as Morgan Freeman stood among the children of St. Mary's, a new chapter began to unfold, one that would weave together past and present, healing and hope, in ways that none of them could have anticipated. What would it take to restore not just the physical structure of St. Mary's, but the spirits of those who called it home? The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the orphanage's worn wooden floors as Morgan Freeman observed the young boy hunched over a tattered notebook. Elijah Carter sat cross-legged in the corner of the common room, his pencil moving with deliberate precision across the pages. The scene stirred something deep within Morgan's memory. Hadn't he once been that same solitary child, lost in his own world of words and dreams? Miss Lorraine appeared at Morgan's side, her weathered hands clasped together with concern. "Elijah's been like that since he arrived 3 years ago," she whispered, careful not to disturb the young writer's concentration. "The journal was the only possession he brought with him. Sometimes I worry about how much time he spends alone." Morgan studied the boy's focused expression, recognizing the familiar furrow of concentration between Elijah's brows. "Some souls need solitude to make sense of their world," he replied, his deep voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "What does Father Thomas think about it?" The mention of Father Thomas brought a slight smile to Miss Lorraine's face. "He's been trying to draw Elijah out through their weekly conversations. Says the boy reminds him of another young dreamer who used to visit these halls." Her knowing glance wasn't lost on Morgan. Across the room, Sarah and Daniel watched Elijah from their spot near the window, their protective instincts evident in their posture. Daniel, the older of the pair, kept one eye on their friend while helping Sarah with her reading. Their makeshift family dynamic touched Morgan deeply. How many such bonds had these walls witnessed over the decades? Father Thomas's arrival in Ninarino, the common room, shifted the atmosphere subtly. The elderly priest's presence always seemed to bring a sense of calm to the children. He nodded to Morgan, a gesture that carried decades of shared understanding. "I see you've noticed our young philosopher," Father Thomas said, joining Morgan and Miss Lorraine. "His words may be private, but his heart speaks volumes." Morgan found himself drawn to Elijah's corner, memories of his own childhood aspirations guiding his steps. The boy's pencil paused mid-sentence, sensing the approaching presence. What thoughts filled those pages? What dreams took shape in the mind of a child who chose words over play? "That must be quite a story you're working on," Morgan offered, keeping his voice gentle and neutral. Elijah's grip on the journal tightened slightly, but curiosity flickered in his eyes as he looked up at the familiar face he'd only seen on television screens. Sarah and Daniel exchanged glances, their protective instincts warring with their own interest in the unexpected interaction. Miss Lorraine held her breath, while Father Thomas watched with quiet anticipation. Could this moment bridge the gap between Elijah's private world and the connection he so clearly needed? The boy's response would set the tone for what was to come, but Morgan already recognized something in Elijah's demeanor, a mirror of his own past self, when words were both shield and sword against life's uncertainties. The question hung in the air. Would Elijah allow someone else to understand the stories he held so close? Miss Lorraine's earlier words echoed in Morgan's mind. 3 years of solitude. 3 years of seeking refuge in written words. What experiences had shaped this young writer's need for expression? The answer, Morgan suspected, lay in those carefully guarded pages. If only Elijah would choose to share them. The common room fell silent, save for the gentle ticking of the old wall clock and the distant sounds of other children playing outside. In this moment of connection between a seasoned storyteller and a budding young writer, the possibilities seemed endless. Would Elijah recognize in Morgan a kindred spirit who understood the power of words to transform, to heal, to create new worlds from the raw material of experience? The afternoon light continued its slow dance across the floor, marking time in golden increments as two generations of dreamers contemplated the bridge between them. What stories would emerge from this unexpected meeting? What changes would ripple through the quiet halls of the orphanage as a result of this simple exchange between a man who had achieved his dreams and a boy still crafting his own? Miss Lorraine's weathered hands trembled slightly as she sorted through the stack of unpaid bills scattered across her desk. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through her office window, a silent witness to her growing anxiety. How much longer could she keep the orphanage's financial struggles hidden from the children? Morgan Freeman, who had been observing the children in the courtyard, noticed Miss Lorraine's distress through the partially open door. The sight transported him back to his own childhood visits to the orphanage, when he'd glimpsed similar worried expressions on the faces of those who ran it. What was it about this place that seemed caught in an eternal struggle between hope and hardship? Father Thomas appeared beside Morgan, his presence as quiet as always. "She's been carrying this burden alone for far too long," he confided, his voice barely above a whisper. The priest's eyes held the weight of years watching Miss Lorraine's silent battles. "The state funding barely covers our basic needs, and private donations have dwindled since the economic downturn." Morgan's attention shifted to the children playing outside, particularly to Elijah, who sat under his favorite oak tree, journal in hand. The boy's peaceful expression contrasted sharply with the tension emanating from Miss Lorraine's office. How many times had Morgan himself sought refuge in writing, unaware of the adult's struggles to keep his sanctuary afloat? Inside her office, Miss Lorraine finally looked up, startled to find both men standing in her doorway. "I didn't realize I had an audience," she said, attempting to shuffle the papers out of sight. But Morgan had already crossed the threshold, his presence filling the small space with an unexpected sense of possibility. "Those bills won't disappear by hiding them," he said gently, taking a seat across from her desk. Father Thomas joined them, closing the door to ensure their conversation remained private. The three adults formed an unlikely council, each connected to the orphanage in different yet profound ways. Miss Lorraine's professional facade cracked slightly as she explained their situation. The building needed urgent repairs, medical expenses for several children were mounting, and their educational programs were severely underfunded. How could she maintain the children's sense of security while standing on such shaky financial ground? Morgan listened intently, his mind already forming connections to potential solutions. He thought of his own success, the networks he'd built, and the influence he now possessed. But more importantly, he remembered the dreams that had taken root in this very building, nurtured by people who refused to give up on children like him. Father Thomas shared stories of past challenges the orphanage had overcome, including the time when a young Morgan Freeman had visited. "This place has a way of bringing the right people together at the right time," he mused, his words carrying a weight that transcended mere coincidence. Miss Lorraine's eyes drifted to the window, where Sarah and Daniel were now trying to coax Elijah into joining their game. The sight of their innocent interaction made her voice catch as she spoke about her fears for their future. "These children deserve so much more than what we can currently provide," she admitted. The conversation shifted from immediate financial concerns to deeper questions about the orphanage's role in shaping young lives. Morgan shared his perspective on how his early experiences with storytelling and creativity had influenced his career path. Could similar opportunities be created for children like Elijah, who found solace in writing? As they discussed potential solutions, the afternoon light continued to fade, casting the office in gentle shadows. The weight of Miss Lorraine's burden seemed to lift slightly as possibilities began to emerge from their conversation. How many other lives could be transformed? If they could secure the orphanage's future, Morgan's presence had inadvertently opened doors that Miss Lorraine thought had been permanently closed. His understanding of both worlds, the struggling child and the successful adult, brought a unique perspective to their challenges. But would it be enough to create lasting change? The meeting concluded with a sense of cautious hope, though the stack of bills remained as a tangible reminder of their immediate concerns. As Morgan prepared to leave, he paused at the door, watching the children's continued play in the dying light. What role would he ultimately play in ensuring the sanctuary remained available for future generations of dreamers? Father Thomas Bennett stood in the chapel's quiet solitude, his weathered hands tracing the aged wood of the last pew, where a young Morgan Freeman once sat decades ago. How many children had passed through these halls, their stories intertwining with the very fabric of St. Catherine's Orphanage. The memory of that particular boy, however, remained crystal clear in his mind. The sound of footsteps drew Father Thomas from his reverie as Morgan Freeman himself entered the chapel, his presence commanding yet gentle. The years had etched their marks on both men, but recognition flickered instantly in the priest's eyes. "The boy who always sat in the back," Father Thomas said softly, reading Shakespeare when he thought no one was watching. Morgan's deep laugh resonated through the chapel. "You caught me more than once, Father." The two men shared a moment of understanding, their connection bridging the decades that had passed. The priest couldn't help but notice how Morgan's gaze drifted to where young Elijah often sat, scribbling in his journal with the same intensity Morgan once showed with his borrowed plays. "That young man, Elijah," Father Thomas began, "reminds me so much of you at that age. The same hunger for words, the same quiet determination." He watched as Morgan's expression softened at the mention of the boy. The actor's visits to the orphanage had not gone unnoticed by anyone, least of all by Father Thomas, who recognized the same spark of potential he had seen years ago. Their conversation turned to Miss Lorraine, and Father Thomas felt the weight of recent revelations press upon him. "She carries so much on her shoulders," he confided, knowing that Morgan had likely sensed the strain beneath her composed exterior, just as Sister Margaret did in your time here. The mention of the former matron brought a thoughtful expression to Morgan's face. "Sister Margaret never let us see her worry either," he recalled, "but we knew. Children always know." His words carried the wisdom of someone who had walked both paths, the child who once needed guidance and the adult who now sought to provide it. Father Thomas observed how Sarah and Daniel had begun to hover near the chapel entrance, their curiosity about Morgan's presence drawing them closer each day. The priest had watched their initial wariness transform into cautious hope, much like he had witnessed countless times before with other children who passed through St. Catherine's doors. "They need more than just shelter and food," Father Thomas said, his voice carrying years of pastoral care. "They need someone to show them possibilities beyond these walls." He didn't need to elaborate. Morgan understood perfectly. The actor's success story had become something of a legend within St. Catherine's, though few knew the full truth of his connection to the place. The conversation shifted to Miss Lorraine's current struggles with the orphanage's finances. Father Thomas shared his concerns about the mounting bills and declining donations, though he maintained his unwavering faith that Providence would provide. Morgan listened intently, his expression revealing that wheels were already turning in his mind. Their discussion was interrupted by Elijah's appearance at the chapel door, his ever-present journal clutched to his chest. The boy hesitated, clearly uncertain whether to enter or retreat. Father Thomas watched as Morgan's entire demeanor softened, reminded of his own past uncertainties and fears. "The more things change," Father Thomas mused, "the more they stay the same. These children, they carry the same dreams we did, face the same demons we faced." He paused, watching as Elijah gathered the courage to approach them. "But sometimes, Morgan, the greatest gift we can offer is simply showing them that those dreams are possible." The priest's words hung in the air as Elijah drew closer, his footsteps echoing in the chapel's sacred space. Father Thomas saw in that moment the beautiful symmetry of past and present, of one generation reaching back to lift up the next. How many more stories would these walls witness? How many more lives would find their turning point within this sanctuary? Morgan's presence had stirred something in St. Catherine's, awakening possibilities that had long lain dormant. Father Thomas recognized the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the way hope had begun to seep back into the cracks of their daily struggles. But could this reunion of past and present provide the miracle they so desperately needed? The dining hall's familiar cadence of clinking plates and murmured conversations filled the air as Morgan Freeman settled into his seat beside Father Thomas. How many meals had these walls witnessed over the decades? The thought struck him as he watched the children file in, their faces a canvas of curiosity and hesitation at his presence. Elijah entered last, clutching his worn journal close to his chest before carefully tucking it into his pocket. He hesitated briefly until Sarah waved him over, her bright smile a beacon in the room. Daniel, already seated beside his unofficial little sister, shifted to make space for their friend. The trio's wordless choreography spoke volumes about their bond, forged in circumstances that had forced them to grow up faster than any child should. Miss Lorraine moved among the tables with practiced ease, her attention seemingly everywhere at once. She paused to wipe a young boy's chin, straightened a girl's collar, and somehow managed to maintain order without raising her voice. Morgan noticed how her eyes frequently returned to Elijah's table, carrying the weight of unspoken concerns. Children seem different when they're together like this, Morgan observed quietly to Father Thomas. More themselves, perhaps? The priest nodded, his weathered hands folded before him. Breaking bread has a way of breaking down walls, doesn't it? Even the most guarded hearts find it difficult to maintain their defenses over a shared meal, as, if to prove his point, Daniel's protective stance softened as he helped Sarah cut her meat into manageable pieces. The boy's usual vigilance, born from years of watching over his younger friends, eased into something more natural, more childlike. Morgan wondered how many such moments of genuine childhood these children managed to salvage from their circumstances. Miss Lorraine finally took her seat at the head table, though her posture suggested she was ready to spring up at a moment's notice. "Morgan, I hope you don't mind our simple fare," she said, her tone carrying both pride and apology. "The best meals are those shared with good company," Morgan replied, his deep voice carrying just far enough to draw several children's attention. He noticed Elijah glancing up, then quickly looking away when their eyes met. What stories lay behind that careful gaze? The conversation flowed naturally as the meal progressed, with Father Thomas sharing carefully chosen memories of Morgan's childhood visits. The children listened with growing interest, their initial wariness giving way to curiosity. How could this famous man have once walked the same halls they did? Sarah, emboldened by the comfortable atmosphere, raised her hand as if in class. "Mr. Freeman, did you have a favorite hiding spot here? Daniel knows all the best ones now." The question drew a few nervous giggles and a gentle admonishment from Miss Lorraine, but Morgan saw the opportunity it presented. "Well, there was this one place behind the old oak bookshelf in the library," he began, watching as several children leaned forward, suddenly more invested in their dinner companion. Daniel's protective mask slipped further as he joined the conversation, pride momentarily overcoming his usual caution. "That's still there. We found—" He caught himself glancing guiltily at Miss Lorraine before continuing more carefully. "I've heard it's still a good spot." The shared laughter that followed seemed to shift something in the room's atmosphere. Even Elijah's hand strayed from his pocket, where his journal lay safely hidden, to rest more comfortably on the table. The boy's shoulders relaxed slightly as Morgan steered the conversation toward stories of his own childhood adventures, carefully selected to resonate with his young audience. Miss Lorraine watched this transformation with quiet amazement. How long had she worked to create such moments of normalcy for these children? Yet here was Morgan, bridging gaps she hadn't even realized existed. She caught Father Thomas's knowing smile and understood. Sometimes the most profound healing began with something as simple as a shared meal and stories that reminded children they weren't alone in their experiences. As the dinner drew to a close, Morgan observed the subtle ways the children had begun to include him in their world. A shared glance here, a half-hidden smile there, and most tellingly, Elijah's hand had moved completely away from his journal, his attention fully present in the moment. What other barriers might fall, given time and patience? The evening meal's warmth lingered in the dining hall, as Morgan Freeman observed Elijah Carter methodically arranging and rearranging his silverware, a habit Miss Lorraine had mentioned, spoke to the boy's need for order in a chaotic world. The other children had scattered to their evening activities, but Elijah remained, his small fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table's surface. Morgan recognized something familiar in the boy's solitude, a reflection of his own childhood experiences within these very walls. How many times had he sat at these same tables, seeking comfort in routine while wrestling with uncertainties that seemed too vast for a child to comprehend? The memory stirred something protective within him, a desire to bridge the gap between Elijah's isolated world and the connection he so clearly needed. "That's quite a system you've got there," Morgan said, his rich voice gentle as he pulled up a chair beside Elijah. The boy's hand stilled, but he didn't look up. "You know, I used to have my own way of organizing things when I was your age. Drove Father Thomas absolutely crazy, though he was much younger then, with fewer gray hairs to show for it." A flicker of interest crossed Elijah's face at the mention of Father Thomas, though he maintained his studied focus on the table. Sarah and Daniel, who had lingered in the doorway out of concern for their friend, exchanged glances before quietly retreating, understanding instinctively that this moment belonged to Elijah alone. Miss Lorraine watched from her position near the kitchen, her heart aching with hope. How many times had she tried to reach past Elijah's carefully constructed walls? The boy's brilliant mind often seemed trapped behind layers of protective silence, his thoughts finding expression only in the journal he guarded so fiercely. "Would you like to hear about the time I accidentally reorganized Father Thomas's entire collection of religious texts?" Morgan continued, noting how Elijah's fingers had stopped their restless movement. "I had this theory that they should be arranged by color rather than subject matter. Thought it would look more like a rainbow that way. More cheerful, you understand?" That Dio, ghost of a smile, tugged at Elijah's lips, though he tried to suppress it. Morgan pressed on, his storytelling voice weaving a tale of childhood mischief and well-intentioned chaos. "Poor Father Thomas spent 3 days trying to put everything back in order, but you know what he did after that?" For the first time, Elijah's eyes lifted to meet Morgan's, curiosity winning over caution. The connection, however brief, felt like a victory. Morgan leaned in slightly as if sharing a precious secret. "He let me help him create a new system, one that made sense to both of us. Sometimes, he told me, we need to find ways to bridge our different ways of seeing the world." The words seemed to resonate with something deep within Elijah. His hands moved to the pocket where his journal rested, a constant companion that held his unspoken thoughts. Morgan noticed the gesture but didn't comment on it directly. Instead, he reached into his own pocket and withdrew a small, worn notebook. "I still carry one of these everywhere I go," he said, placing it on the table between them. "Some thoughts are too precious or too complicated for speaking aloud. They need time to grow on paper first, like seeds in good soil." Elijah's gaze fixed on the notebook, his expression shifting from guarded to contemplative. Miss Lorraine, still watching from her post, felt tears prick at her eyes as she witnessed this careful dance of trust beginning to unfold. How had Morgan known exactly how to approach the boy who had resisted so many other attempts at connection? The answer perhaps lay in the shared experience of finding solace in words when the world seemed too overwhelming to navigate. Morgan understood the language of silence because he had once spoken it himself, within these very walls. Now, as he sat with Elijah in the quiet of the dining hall, he was offering something more valuable than mere conversation. He was extending an invitation to be understood. But would Elijah accept this offering? Could the walls that had protected him for so long begin to lower in the presence of someone who recognized his struggle so intimately? The questions hung in the air between them, as delicate as spider silk and just as strong in their potential to connect two separate worlds. Sarah's small frame perched on the weathered wooden bench in the orphanage's garden, her feet dangling, inches above the ground as she watched Morgan Freeman tend to the withering tomato plants. Her presence had become a constant during his visits, her curious eyes following his every movement with an intensity that spoke of something deeper than mere childhood fascination. "Mr. Freeman," she called out, her voice carrying the kind of innocence that only an 8-year-old could possess. "Do you think dreams can come true?" The question hung in the air, weighted with the hopes of a child who had already faced more disappointment than most adults. Morgan straightened from his gardening, brushing soil from his hands as he considered her question. He had noticed how Sarah often lingered in the background during his interactions with Elijah, her watchful gaze carrying an unspoken yearning. What dreams could such a young soul harbor in a place where reality often proved harsh? "Dreams are like these tomato plants, Sarah," he began, settling beside her on the bench. "They need nurturing, patience, and sometimes a little help from others to grow." His words drew a thoughtful expression from the young girl, her fingers absently tracing patterns on her worn dress. Sarah shared how she dreamed of becoming a teacher, inspired by Miss Lorraine's dedication to their education. Her eyes sparkled as she described wanting to help other children learn to read, just as Daniel had helped her master difficult words. The mention of her unofficial big brother brought a smile to Morgan's face, remembering how the 12-year-old boy had taken Sarah under his wing from the moment she arrived at the orphanage. Their conversation drifted to Sarah's observations about Elijah, revealing insights that even Miss Lorraine hadn't noticed. She spoke of how Elijah would often write in his journal late at night, using the moonlight streaming through their dormitory windows. "He writes stories about families," she confided, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Sometimes I hear him reading them to himself when he thinks everyone's asleep." Morgan recognized the profound trust Sarah was placing in him by sharing these intimate details about her friend. Her protective nature toward Elijah rivaled Daniel's own guardianship over her, creating a chain of care among the children that touched Morgan deeply. How had these young souls managed to forge such strong bonds in the face of abandonment? The conversation took an unexpected turn when Sarah revealed her own hidden talent for drawing. From beneath the bench, she produced a carefully folded piece of paper containing a sketch of the orphanage garden. The simple lines captured not just the physical space but the essence of their sanctuary, complete with stick figures representing their makeshift family. "Miss Lorraine says art helps us express what we can't say with words," Sarah explained, her fingers smoothing the creases in her drawing, like how Elijah uses his stories. The parallel between the two forms of expression wasn't lost on Morgan, who began to see how these children had developed their own languages of hope. Father Thomas's appearance in the garden prompted Sarah to share how the priest had encouraged her artistic endeavors, often providing her with precious sheets of paper and worn-down pencils. The elderly man's dedication to nurturing the children's talents, despite the orphanage's limited resources, exemplified the kind of support that made dreams possible. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden, Sarah's revelation about her dreams sparked a realization in Morgan. These children didn't just need material support. They needed someone to witness their hopes, to validate their aspirations. How many dreams had gone unspoken within these walls, waiting for the right moment or the right person to be shared? The conversation with Sarah would prove instrumental in Morgan's understanding of not just Elijah, but all the children under Miss Lorraine's care. Each child carried their own dreams, carefully protected and nurtured despite their circumstances. What other stories waited to be discovered among these resilient young souls? Sarah's hope, expressed through her art and her candid conversations, represented more than just childhood fantasy. It demonstrated the power of dreams to sustain the spirit, even in the most challenging circumstances. How could Morgan help transform these precious dreams from mere possibilities into achievable realities? Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As Sarah gathered her drawing and prepared to join the other children for dinner, she paused, turning back to Morgan with a question that would echo in his thoughts long after. "Do you think Elijah will ever share his stories with us?" The query carried the weight of collective concern for their friend, revealing how deeply these children cared for one another's dreams. Daniel's watchful gaze never strayed far from Sarah and Elijah as they gathered in the orphanage's common room. At 12, he carried himself with the gravity of someone much older, his shoulders squared against burdens no child should bear. How had he become the self-appointed guardian of the younger children? The answer lay buried in countless nights of comforting crying newcomers and standing up to playground bullies. Morgan Freeman observed Daniel's protective instincts with a familiar ache in his heart. He recognized that same fierce determination he'd once possessed as a young boy when the world seemed too large and adults too distant to rely upon. The way Daniel positioned himself between the door and the younger children, how his eyes constantly scanned for potential threats. These weren't behaviors that developed by chance. Miss Lorraine had noticed this dynamic long ago, often finding Daniel awake past midnight, checking on the younger ones during thunderstorms or after particularly difficult days. She shared these observations with Morgan in hushed tones, her voice carrying equal measures of pride and concern. "He's their shield," she explained, "but sometimes I worry about who shields him." The relationship between Daniel and the younger children had evolved organically over time. When new orphans arrived, disoriented and afraid, Daniel would be the first to show them around to explain the unwritten rules of their small community. He'd developed a particular soft spot for Sarah, whose infectious optimism seemed to pierce even his most serious moments. With Elijah, the connection was different, a quiet understanding between two old souls. Father Thomas had attempted to ease Daniel's self-imposed responsibilities, reminding him that it was okay to be a child himself. But how could anyone convince a boy to set down a mantle he'd chosen to carry? The weight of protection had become as much a part of Daniel as his own name. Morgan recognized an opportunity to connect with Daniel through their shared instinct to protect. During one afternoon, as Daniel kept his usual vigil, Morgan approached him with stories of his own experiences as a young protector. He spoke of the strength found in allowing others to help carry the load, of the courage it takes to sometimes step back and trust. The conversation revealed layers of Daniel's character that even Miss Lorraine hadn't fully understood. His protective nature stemmed not just from a desire to shield the younger children from harm, but from a deep-seated fear of losing the only family he'd ever known. Every new child who arrived at the orphanage became another thread in the tapestry of belonging he'd woven around himself. Daniel's relationship with Sarah and Elijah illustrated this complex dynamic perfectly. With Sarah, he embodied the role of big brother, ready with a joke to lift her spirits, or a stern word to guide her choices. For Elijah, Daniel served as a silent guardian, respecting the younger boy's need for space while ensuring he never felt truly alone. The depth of Daniel's commitment became clear during a particularly challenging day when a potential adoptive family visited the orphanage. The couple had shown interest in Sarah, and while everyone else celebrated this possibility, Daniel withdrew into himself. Morgan found him later in the garden, struggling to reconcile his desire for Sarah's happiness with his fear of the family being separated. This moment of vulnerability allowed Morgan to share wisdom about the nature of true protection. Sometimes it meant supporting someone's journey away from you. The conversation marked a turning point in Daniel's understanding of his role in the lives of the younger children. Could he learn to protect them while also allowing them to grow beyond the safety of his watch? Miss Lorraine noticed the subtle changes in Daniel following his conversations with Morgan. The boy still maintained his protective stance, but there was a new softness to his vigilance. He began encouraging Sarah to share her dreams with potential families, and his interactions with Elijah took on a more collaborative rather than protective nature. Father Thomas observed this transformation with quiet satisfaction, recognizing how Morgan's presence had helped Daniel begin to balance his protective instincts with the understanding that growth sometimes required letting go. The boy who had appointed himself guardian of all was learning that protection could take many forms, and that sometimes the bravest thing a protector could do was step aside. What would become of this newfound wisdom? How would Daniel's evolution affect the delicate balance of relationships within the orphanage? The answers would unfold in their own time. But for now, the sight of Daniel teaching the younger children to protect themselves, rather than simply protecting them, suggested hope for the future. Morgan's footsteps echoed through the quiet halls of St. Catherine's Orphanage as he made his way to the library. his mind wandering to the countless hours he'd spent there as a child. The familiar scent of aged paper and wood polish triggered memories he thought long buried. How many afternoons had he escaped into worlds of adventure and possibility within these very walls? The library remained largely unchanged, though smaller, than he remembered. Wooden shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, their dark finish worn smooth by decades of searching hands. Morgan ran his fingers along the spines, remembering how each book had felt like a friend during his loneliest days. What secrets did these shelves still hold? What stories had they witnessed? As he browsed the collection, Daniel appeared in the doorway, his protective instincts evident in his hesitant stance. The 12-year-old had been watching Morgan's interactions with the younger children, particularly Elijah, with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Morgan understood this vigilance. He'd once been that older child feeling responsible for the younger ones. "I used to hide in here too," Morgan said softly, not turning around. "Sometimes from the older kids, sometimes from myself." He heard Daniel's quiet intake of breath, surprised perhaps that an adult would admit to such vulnerability. Morgan's attention caught on a familiar spine, a worn copy of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. His heart quickened as he carefully pulled it from the shelf. Could it be? Opening the cover revealed a childish scrawl on the inside page, "Property of Morgan Freeman, 1955. The memory rushed back with startling clarity. His first paycheck? From delivering newspapers spent entirely on this book, which he'd later donated to the Orphanage library. Daniel moved closer, his curiosity temporarily overcoming his guardedness. "That's your name," he observed, peering at the faded inscription. "You really lived here?" Morgan nodded, carefully turning the yellowed pages. "I did. And this book, it was my escape when things got tough. Stories have power, Daniel. They show us who we could become." The sound of small feet interrupted their conversation as Sarah appeared, followed closely by Elijah, who clutched his journal to his chest like a shield. The three children formed an unconscious triangle, with Daniel, slightly in front, maintaining his protective stance. "What did you find?" Sarah asked, her 8-year-old voice carrying the perpetual enthusiasm that Morgan had come to associate with her. Morgan held up the book, watching as Elijah's eyes widened with recognition. "You've read this one, haven't you?" Morgan asked, the quiet boy noting how his grip on the journal loosened slightly. Elijah nodded, taking a tentative step forward. "It's my favorite," he whispered, then added with a hint of pride, "I've read it 3 times. The moment was interrupted by Miss Lorraine's arrival, her expression softening as she took in the scene before her. She'd been watching Morgan's interactions with the children carefully over the past few days, her initial wariness gradually giving way to cautious hope. "I see you found your old friend," she said, nodding toward the book in Morgan's hands. "Father Thomas mentioned you donated some books before you left." Morgan's surprise must have shown on his face because Miss Lorraine smiled. "We keep records of all donations. Your name appears several times in the old ledgers." The revelation stirred something in Morgan's chest, a connection to his past self, the boy who'd wanted to leave something meaningful behind. He looked at the 3 children before him, each carrying their own burdens, their own stories waiting to be told. How many other children had found solace in these pages over the years? Daniel's stance had relaxed somewhat, though his eyes remained watchful. Sarah had edged closer to examine the book, while Elijah's journal had dropped to his side, no longer held as a barrier between himself and the world. These small changes spoke volumes about the trust slowly building between them. Miss Lorraine moved to the library's ancient card catalog, pulling out a drawer with practiced ease. "There should be records of your other donations here," she said, fingers dancing through the yellowed cards. "Perhaps we could make a project of finding them all?" The suggestion lit up Sarah's face, while Daniel tried to hide his interest behind a mask of indifference. But it was Elijah's reaction that caught Morgan's attention. The boy had opened his journal, pen poised above a blank page, ready to record this new chapter in their unfolding story. What other forgotten treasures waited to be discovered on these shelves? What connections would they reveal between past and present? Between the children Morgan had known and those who stood before him now, the library held these secrets and more, waiting for the right moment to share them. Morgan Freeman's weathered hands trembled slightly as he held the familiar book, its pages yellowed with time, but still bearing the careful inscription he'd written decades ago. The children gathered around him in the orphanage's small library, their eyes wide with anticipation. Elijah, who usually kept to himself, had chosen to sit closest to Morgan, his journal clutched protectively against his chest. Miss I. Lorraine watched from the doorway, her heart warming at the sight of the usually reserved Elijah inching closer to hear better. Sarah had settled cross-legged on the floor, while Daniel stood nearby trying to maintain his air of teenage indifference, but unable to hide his interest completely. "You know," Morgan began, his rich voice filling the room, "every story has a secret life of its own. It's just waiting for someone to discover it." He opened the book and the familiar scent of aged paper wafted through the air. "When I was about your age, sitting right here in this very room, these words became my escape, my adventure, my hope." Father Thomas, who had quietly joined the group, smiled knowingly. He remembered the young Morgan who had once sat in this same library, devouring books as if they were precious treasures. The parallels between past and present weren't lost on him, especially as he observed Elijah's rapt attention. As Morgan's voice brought the characters to life, something remarkable began to happen. Sarah unconsciously leaned forward, her usual, fidgeting forgotten. Daniel's carefully maintained facade of disinterest crumbled as he found himself drawn into the story. Even Miss Lorraine, who had intended to only stay for a moment, found herself pulled into a nearby chair, transported by the magic of storytelling. The tale Morgan chose wasn't just any story. It was one about a young boy who discovered he had the power to change his world through words. With each carefully crafted sentence, Morgan wove connections between the story and his audience. He paused at just the right moments, allowing the children's imagination to fill in the spaces between words. Elijah's grip on his journal gradually loosened as he became immersed in the story. His eyes darted between Morgan's expressive face and the book, as if trying to understand how mere words could create such vivid pictures in his mind. Without realizing it, he began to whisper along with certain passages, having memorized them from his own secret reading sessions in the library. "Monsieur," Lorraine noticed how Morgan would occasionally glance at Elijah, adjusting his tone and pace to match the boy's reactions. It was a subtle dance of storyteller and listener, one that spoke of an understanding that went beyond the simple act of reading aloud. She wondered if Morgan saw in Elijah a reflection of his younger self, another lonely child finding solace in stories. The other children from the orphanage began to drift in, drawn by Morgan's compelling voice. Soon, the library was filled with young faces, each lost in the world being created before them. Father Thomas observed how even the most troubled children seemed to find peace in these moments, their usual restlessness replaced by quiet attention. Daniel, despite his initial reluctance, had gradually moved closer to Sarah, unconsciously fulfilling his role as protective older brother. His expression softened as he watched his younger friend become completely engrossed in the story, her usual anxieties temporarily forgotten in the magic of the moment. As Morgan approached the story's climax, he paused, looking around at his captive audience. The connection between them had grown stronger with each turned page, creating a shared experience that transcended the ordinary boundaries of their daily lives. In this moment, they weren't just listener and reader. They were fellow travelers on an extraordinary journey. Miss Lorraine caught Father Thomas's eye, sharing a knowing look. They had both seen many visitors come and go, but Morgan's presence was different. He wasn't just reading to these children. He was showing them a path forward, demonstrating how stories could become bridges between past and present, between loneliness and connection. The story continued to unfold, but something else was happening beneath the surface. Each word seemed to carry a special meaning for Elijah, who had begun to write in his journal during the brief pauses, his pencil moving quickly across the page. What thoughts were being sparked in that young mind? What dreams were taking shape in the fertile soil of imagination? Morgan's voice carried them through to the end of the chapter, but the story's effect lingered in the room like a gentle echo. The children sat in that magical moment of silence that follows a well-told tale, their minds still walking through the world they had just visited. Who could tell what seeds had been planted in these young hearts during these precious moments? In the quiet moments after another captivating reading session, Morgan Freeman noticed Elijah lingering behind while the other children filed out of the library. The boy clutched his worn journal close to his chest, his fingers nervously tracing the frayed edges of its pages. What secrets did those pages hold that made the young writer so protective of their contents? Morgan had observed this behavior over the past few weeks. How Elijah would scribble furiously during free periods. How he'd snap the journal shut whenever Sarah or Daniel approached, and how Miss Lorraine would cast concerned glances in his direction. Even Father Thomas had mentioned the boy's increasing withdrawal into his private world of words. "Mr. Freeman?" Elijah's voice barely carried across the room. "Remember when you said writers need readers?" His hands tightened around the journal as he took a tentative step forward. Morgan simply nodded, giving the boy space to find his courage. How many times had he himself faced this moment of vulnerability as a young artist? The connection between them had grown steadily since Morgan's first visit to the orphanage. Through shared stories and quiet conversations, trust had built slowly, but surely. Morgan recognized in Elijah the same burning desire to create that had driven him throughout his career, that need to capture life's mysteries in words. Elijah moved closer, his footsteps echoing in the empty library. "I wrote something about my mother." The words caught in his throat, but he pressed on. "Not my real mother, the one I imagine." His eyes darted to the door where Miss Lorraine often stood, watching over her charges with quiet devotion. Morgan understood the complexity of Elijah's confession. In an orphanage, family was both an absence and a presence, the families they had lost mingling with the ones they'd found. How did a young heart navigate such emotional terrain? Through stories, Morgan knew, through giving shape to hopes and fears on paper. "Would you like to share it with me?" Morgan kept his voice gentle, neutral. Pushing too hard could cause Elijah to retreat back into his shell. The boy had to take this step on his own terms. After what seemed like an eternity, Elijah nodded. His fingers trembled as he opened the journal to a dog-eared page covered in careful handwriting. The story that emerged was both heartbreaking and beautiful. A tale of a mother who sang to the stars, who could bake cookies that tasted like sunshine, who knew exactly when to hug and when to step back. Morgan recognized pieces of Miss Lorraine in the description, mixed with universal longings and specific details that could only have come from Elijah's imagination. The boy had created something real from the raw material of his hopes and observations. Wasn't that what all artists did? Sarah and Daniel appeared in the story too, though under different names, the siblings who shared their snacks and kept secrets. Father Thomas became a wise old tree in the mother's garden, offering shade and shelter to all who needed it. Even Morgan himself had a cameo as a traveling storyteller who taught children to believe in magic. As Elijah read, his voice grew stronger. The words flowed more smoothly, and his shoulders relaxed. This was more than just sharing a story. It was an act of trust, a bridge being built between his private world and the larger one around him. How many other stories were waiting to be told in this place? Miss Lorraine appeared silently in the doorway partway through the reading, but Morgan caught her eye and gave a slight shake of his head. This moment belonged to Elijah. The boy needed to finish his story without knowing he had a larger audience, needed to experience the pure connection between writer and listener without self-consciousness intruding. When the last words faded into silence, Elijah looked up at Morgan with a mixture of hope and fear. What would this man he'd come to respect think of his simple tale? But Morgan saw beyond the occasional grammatical mistakes and rushed passages. He saw the heart of a true storyteller emerging. "You've given your characters life," Morgan said, simply. "They breathe on the page." He watched Elijah process this praise, saw something shift in the boy's expression. Would this be the moment that gave him the confidence to share his gift more widely? The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway signaled the end of their private conference. Soon, Sarah and Daniel would burst in, full of energy and questions about tomorrow's reading session. But something had changed in the library's atmosphere. A door had been opened, a trust established. Elijah carefully closed his journal, but his grip on it was lighter now, less desperate. He had shared his secret and found acceptance. What other stories would flow from his pen now that he knew he had an audience who understood? The evening shadows stretched across Miss Lorraine's office as she sat across from Morgan Freeman, her weathered hands clasped tightly in her lap. The weight of untold worries lined her face, and Morgan couldn't help but notice how she seemed to have aged years in the weeks since his first visit to St. Catherine's Orphanage. "I've been carrying this burden alone for so long," Miss Lorraine began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Father Thomas knows some of it, but not everything." She paused, gathering her thoughts as Morgan waited patiently, understanding the difficulty of such revelations. The connection between them had grown stronger since Elijah had shared his journal with Morgan earlier that day. Perhaps it was this act of trust from one of her most guarded children that finally gave Miss Lorraine the courage to speak openly about the orphanage's dire situation. "We're not just facing financial difficulties," she continued, her voice strengthening with each word. "The building itself is failing us. Last winter, we lost heat in the East Wing for 3 weeks. The children huddled together in the main hall, sleeping on cots while we tried to keep them warm." Her eyes grew distant, remembering those challenging nights. Morgan leaned forward, his presence offering silent support as Miss Lorraine revealed the full scope of their crisis. The orphanage's foundation was crumbling, both literally and figuratively. The local council had already issued 2 warnings about building code violations, and their primary funding source, a generous annual grant from a local foundation, was being discontinued. "But it's not just the building or the money, Miss A," Lorraine said, rising to pace near the window. "It's the children. They deserve so much more than we can give them." She turned to face Morgan, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Elijah, Sarah, Daniel, they're just 3 of 28 children who call this place home. Each one carries their own wounds, their own stories." The mention of the 3 children sparked a memory of Morgan's earlier conversation with Father Thomas, who had shared his own concerns about the mounting pressures on Miss Lorraine. The priest had noticed her working later each night, skipping meals and carrying the weight of every child's future on her shoulders. "When did you last take a day off, Miss Lorraine?" Morgan asked gently, though he suspected he already knew the answer. She laughed softly, but there was no joy in the sound. "Time off? The children don't get days off from being orphans, Mr. Freeman. How could I possibly step away?" The reality of her dedication struck Morgan deeply. Here was a woman who had given everything to these children, who had created a family from broken pieces, and who now faced the very real possibility of watching it all fall apart. How many sleepless nights had she spent worrying about their future? How many meals had she skipped to ensure the children had enough? "There's something else," Miss Lorraine added, returning to her seat. "Something I haven't told anyone, not even Father Thomas." She pulled a letter from her desk drawer, her hands trembling slightly as she handed it to Morgan. "The state inspector is coming next month. If we can't address the major safety concerns by then..." Her voice trailed off, leaving the devastating possibility unspoken. Morgan scanned the official document, his heart sinking as he read the detailed list of violations and requirements. The deadline loomed impossibly close, and the estimated costs for repairs were staggering. But it was the final paragraph that truly revealed the stakes. Failure to comply would result in immediate closure and the dispersal of all children to other facilities across the state. "They would separate them," Miss Lorraine whispered, voicing Morgan's exact thought. "Sarah and Daniel, who've become like real siblings. Elijah, who's finally beginning to open up. All of them, scattered to different corners of the state, forced to start over again." The weight of this revelation settled heavily in the room. Morgan thought of Elijah's journal, filled with stories of friendship and family found within these walls. He thought of Sarah's infectious laugh during yesterday's art class and Daniel's protective stance whenever younger children needed help. How could anyone consider tearing apart these bonds? "Have you explored all possible options?" Morgan asked, his mind already racing through potential solutions. But Miss Lorraine's tired smile told him she had already traveled down every conceivable path. "We've appealed to every charitable organization in the region. We've organized fundraisers, written grants, even considered selling some of our land." She shook her head slowly. "But the numbers are simply too large, and time is running out." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with implications and unspoken fears. What would become of these children who had already lost so much? How could they face another displacement, another disruption to their fragile sense of security? Morgan sat in thoughtful silence, remembering his own childhood visits to St. Catherine's, how this place had once offered him hope when he needed it most. Now, decades later, he found himself uniquely positioned to understand both the children's perspective and the administrative challenges facing Miss Lorraine. But understanding wasn't enough. As the evening shadows deepened outside Miss Lorraine's window, Morgan realized that knowledge carried responsibility. The question wasn't whether to help, but how to transform this crisis into an opportunity for renewal. What would it take to save not just the building, but the family that had grown within its walls? Father Thomas stood at his office window, watching Morgan Freeman's silhouette against the setting sun. The actor had spent another full day with the children, particularly with young Elijah, whose transformation over the past weeks had been nothing short of remarkable. What started as a simple visit had evolved into something far more meaningful, touching lives in ways none of them had anticipated. "You know, Morgan," Father Thomas began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of service. "When you first walked through those doors weeks ago, I saw that same determined look you had as a child. Some things never change, do they?" Morgan turned from the window, his eyes meeting the priest's knowing gaze. "The faces are different, Father, but the need remains the same. These children, especially Elijah, they remind me so much of myself, at that age, lost, searching for direction yet full of untapped potential." The conversation shifted to Miss Lorraine's earlier confession about the orphanage's financial struggles. Father Thomas's weathered hands clasped together as he shared his perspective on the delicate balance between hope and reality. "It's not just about the money, Morgan. These children need more than just financial security. They need what you've been giving them, a vision of what's possible." Morgan settled into one of the worn leather chairs, his presence filling the modest office. When I see Sarah and Daniel supporting each other, or the way Elijah's eyes light up when he shares his writing, I'm reminded of how crucial these early connections are. But Father, what happens when we leave? When the excitement fades?" The priest's response carried years of pastoral wisdom. "The seeds we plant don't always bloom immediately, Morgan. Remember how that drama teacher's visit affected you all those years ago? Sometimes a single moment of genuine connection can sustain a child. Through years of uncertainty, their discussion turned to specific children. Father Thomas shared observations about Daniel's protective nature toward Sarah, how it mirrored Morgan's own emerging role as a mentor. "The boy watches you, you know, not as a celebrity, but as someone who walked these same halls and found his way." Morgan reflected on Miss Lorraine's dedication, her tireless efforts to maintain stability despite mounting challenges. "She reminds me of Sister Margaret from my time here. Same unwavering commitment, same fierce protection of her charges." "Indeed," Father Thomas nodded. "And like Sister Margaret, she carries burdens she shouldn't have to bear alone." The question becomes, Morgan, how do we transform this moment into lasting change? The conversation deepened as they explored possibilities for sustainable support. Morgan shared his vision of creating a foundation that would extend beyond immediate financial aid, incorporating mentorship programs and educational opportunities. Father Thomas listened intently, occasionally offering insights from his years of experience with similar initiatives. "The children need roots and wings," Father Thomas mused, "stability to grow and inspiration to soar. What you're proposing could provide both." Their discussion was interrupted by distant laughter, Elijah reading one of his stories to Sarah and Daniel in the courtyard below. The sound carried a promise of possibility, a reminder of why their conversation mattered beyond the walls of this office. Morgan's response reflected the evolution of his own journey from visitor to invested participant in these children's lives. Perhaps that's what this has always been about, Father. Not just giving back, but creating a circle of support that continues long after we're gone. Father Thomas rose slowly, moving to his desk where photographs of countless children spanned decades of service. Each one leaves a mark, Morgan. Each story becomes part of our story. The question is, how will we ensure these current chapters lead to stronger futures? The weight of responsibility settled between them, not as a burden, but as a shared commitment to transform good intentions into lasting impact. How would they bridge the gap between immediate needs and long-term solutions? What role would each of them play in crafting a sustainable future for these children who had unknowingly changed their own lives in the process of being helped? In the quiet solitude of his hotel room, Morgan Freeman sat in contemplation, his weathered hands folded beneath his chin as he reflected on Father Thomas's words from their earlier conversation. The gentle hum of the air conditioning provided a backdrop to his thoughts, which kept circling back to Elijah's determined face bent over his journal, to Sarah's hopeful eyes, and to Daniel's protective stance whenever anyone came too close, to his makeshift family. How could one help without disrupting the delicate ecosystem that Miss Lorraine had cultivated within the orphanage walls? The question nagged at him, persistent as a splinter under skin. His own childhood experiences had taught him the value of stability, however tenuous it might be. Would his intervention, however well-intentioned, create ripples that could destabilize the children's sense of security? Father Thomas's gentle reminder about responsibility echoed in his mind. These children need consistency more than they need grand gestures, the priest had said, his eyes holding decades of wisdom. Morgan understood this truth deeply. He'd lived it himself. The orphanage had been his temporary haven too, though, in a different era, under different circumstances. Miss Lorraine's exhausted but determined demeanor reminded him of the caretakers from his own past. He'd noticed how she stretched the meager resources, making sure every child felt seen and valued. Despite the limitations, her careful attention to Elijah's withdrawn nature, her gentle encouragement of Sarah's artistic endeavors, and her firm but loving guidance of Daniel's protective instincts demonstrated a level of dedication that money alone couldn't buy. The actor pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found his financial advisor's number. He'd been blessed with success beyond his wildest childhood dreams. But what good was that success if it couldn't be channeled into meaningful change? Yet, the complexity of the situation demanded more than just writing a check. Elijah's journal. Writings particularly touched something deep within Morgan. The boy's words, raw and honest, revealed a soul trying to make sense of abandonment and hope, of loss and possibility. Morgan recognized that same drive that had pushed him forward in his own youth. The need to create, to express, to transform pain into something meaningful. His thoughts turned to the practical aspects of assistance. The orphanage needed structural repairs, updated educational materials, and probably a dozen other things that Miss Lorraine was too proud to mention. But beyond the material needs, these children needed something more intangible. They needed to believe in possibilities. Daniel's protective nature toward Sarah and Elijah showed a maturity beyond his years, but it also revealed the weight of responsibility he'd taken upon his young shoulders. Morgan wondered how to ease that burden while preserving the boy's dignity and natural leadership qualities. Sarah's artistic talents could flourish with proper nurturing, but who would provide the consistent encouragement she needed? The conversation with Father Thomas had highlighted another crucial aspect, the importance of sustainable support rather than temporary solutions. The priest had shared stories of well-meaning donors who swept in with grand promises only to disappear, leaving the children more disillusioned than before. Morgan was determined not to repeat that pattern. He began jotting down ideas in his own notebook, a habit he'd never abandoned despite his success. Perhaps a structured program that combined educational support with creative outlets. Something that could continue even when he wasn't physically present. The children's faces floated before his mind's eye. Elijah's serious expression when sharing his writings, Sarah's shy smile when showing her drawings, Daniel's proud stance when helping the younger ones. Miss Lorraine's words from earlier, that day resurfaced in his memory. These children don't need pity, they need opportunity. She'd said it with such conviction, even as she struggled to keep the electricity bills paid and food on the table. How could he provide opportunities without undermining her authority or the children's sense of self-reliance? The weight of the decision pressed upon him like a physical presence. Whatever action he chose would impact not just the current residents, but potentially generations to come. The responsibility felt enormous, yet somehow right. As if all his years of success had been leading to this moment of choice. Morgan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. Somewhere out there in the orphanage he'd visited earlier, children were sleeping, dreaming, hoping. What role would he play in turning those hopes into reality? The question lingered as he began to formulate a plan that would honor both the children's potential and the dedication of those who cared for them. The evening air carried a gentle breeze across St. Michael's grounds as Morgan Freeman stood at the window of his temporary quarters, his thoughts drifting to the young boy who reminded him so much of himself. Through the glass, he could see Elijah Carter sitting alone on a wooden bench in the garden, his small figure illuminated by the soft glow of outdoor lamps. The boy's journal lay open in his lap, but his eyes were fixed on the emerging stars above. Morgan had spent the past few days carefully observing the dynamics at St. Michael's, particularly the delicate balance Miss Lorraine maintained between nurturing the children and preparing them for the harsh realities that awaited beyond the orphanage walls. How many nights had he himself sat in that same garden, dreaming of a future that seemed impossibly distant? Without conscious decision, Morgan found himself walking through the quiet hallways and out into the garden. His footsteps were deliberate, but gentle on the stone path, not wanting to startle Elijah from his contemplation. The boy's head turned slightly at his approach, acknowledging his presence without breaking his starward gaze. "The stars look different here than in the city," Morgan offered, his deep voice carrying naturally in the evening quiet. "Less hidden." Elijah's fingers traced the edges of his journal pages, a habit Morgan had noticed whenever the boy felt uncertain. "Did you look at them too, when you were here?" The question carried more weight than its simple words suggested. Morgan settled onto the bench, leaving enough space to respect Elijah's personal boundaries while remaining close enough for conversation. "Every night I could. There was something about them that made everything else seem manageable. Miss Lorraine says they're like stories waiting to be told," Elijah said, finally looking at Morgan directly. "That's why people made constellations, to remember the important things." Morgan noted how Elijah's grip on his journal relaxed slightly as he spoke about stories. The boy had a writer's soul, something Miss Lorraine had mentioned during their earlier conversations. How many of his own thoughts and dreams lay captured in those pages? "What kind of stories do you see up there, Elijah?" Morgan asked, genuinely curious about the boy's perspective. Elijah's response came slowly, thoughtfully. "Sometimes I see the stories of people who left here, where they might have gone, what they might be doing now." He paused, then added more quietly, "Sometimes I try to write my own story up there." The vulnerability in those words struck Morgan deeply. He remembered his own childhood attempts to author his future, to write himself into a story different from the one he'd been given. How many of the children at St. Michael's engaged in the same nightly ritual? "You know, Elijah, the most powerful stories aren't always the ones we find in books or see in the stars," Morgan said, carefully choosing his words. "Sometimes they're the ones we carry inside us, waiting for the right moment to be told." A subtle shift occurred in Elijah's posture, his shoulders straightening slightly. "Is that why you came back here, to tell your story?" The question caught Morgan off guard with its insight. Here was a child who understood intuitively what many adults struggled to grasp, the power of returning to one's beginnings. How could he explain that his return to St. Michael's had revealed more questions than answers? "Perhaps," Morgan acknowledged. "Or maybe I came back to help others find their stories." He glanced at Elijah's journal. Like the ones you're writing in there. The boy's hand instinctively covered the pages, but his expression remained open, curious. Miss Lorraine says writing helps us understand things better, but sometimes I write things and they still don't make sense. Morgan recognized the frustration in Elijah's voice, the struggle to reconcile internal narratives with external realities. It was a challenge he'd faced throughout his own journey from St. Michael's to the world beyond. How could he help this young writer understand that confusion was often the first step toward clarity? Their conversation drifted into comfortable silence, both of them watching as more stars emerged in the darkening sky. In that shared moment, Morgan realized that perhaps the most valuable gift he could offer wasn't answers or direction, but simply the understanding that someone else had once sat in this same garden, under these same stars, wrestling with similar questions. The evening bell chimed softly in the distance, signaling the approach of bedtime. Elijah closed his journal, but made no move to leave, as if reluctant to break the spell of their conversation. Morgan understood. Some moments carried a weight that made them difficult to leave behind. The Sacred Heart Orphanage chapel stood silent in the early morning light, save for the soft whispers of a young girl's prayer. Sarah knelt before the altar, her small hands clasped tightly together, unaware of Morgan Freeman's presence in the doorway. He had risen early, unable to shake the lingering effects of his starlit conversation with Elijah the night before when he heard the gentle murmur of her voice. "Dear God," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying through the empty chapel. "Please help Miss Lorraine smile more. She works so hard for all of us, but sometimes I see her crying when she thinks we're asleep." The raw honesty in the child's prayer caught Morgan off guard, stirring something deep within his chest. Sarah continued, unaware of her audience. "And please watch over Daniel. He pretends he's not scared about turning 13 next month, but I know he is. He thinks they'll make him leave us because he's getting too old." Her voice quivered slightly, revealing the fear she shared with her unofficial brother. Morgan remained motionless, his hand resting on the wooden doorframe. How many prayers had these walls absorbed over the years? How many children had knelt, where Sarah now knelt, their hearts heavy with similar concerns? He remembered his own visits to this chapel decades ago, though he had never found the courage to pray aloud as Sarah did now. And God, Sarah's voice grew softer, more hesitant. "Could you please help Elijah? He writes in his journal all the time, but he won't tell anyone what's wrong. Even Miss Lorraine can't get him to talk about it." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "Maybe you could send someone to help him? Someone who understands what it's like to be different?" The irony of her request wasn't lost on Morgan. Hadn't he spent the previous evening doing exactly that, connecting with Elijah over their shared love of storytelling? But Sarah's prayer revealed a deeper concern within the orphanage's walls, one that extended beyond a single child's struggles. Father Thomas's footsteps echoed softly behind Morgan, but neither man spoke, both unwilling to interrupt Sarah's intimate moment. The priest's presence reminded Morgan of his own childhood visits to Sacred Heart, of the countless times he had witnessed similar scenes of vulnerability and hope. "And last thing, God," Sarah's voice grew stronger, more determined. "Could you help Mr. Freeman see how special this place is? Daniel says he's famous and important, but Miss Lorraine says everyone needs a home in their heart. Maybe Sacred Heart could be one of his homes too." Morgan felt Father Thomas's hand rest gently on his shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes about their shared understanding of the moment. The simple wisdom in Sarah's prayer, her concern for others above herself, her insight into the needs of those around her, painted a vivid picture of the community Miss Lorraine had fostered within these walls. The sound of footsteps from the dormitory wing broke the spell. Sarah quickly crossed herself and rose, turning to find Morgan and Father Thomas in the doorway. Instead of embarrassment, her face lit up with a smile that reflected the rising sun streaming through the stained glass windows. "Good morning, Mr. Freeman." "Good morning, Father Thomas," she called out cheerfully, as if her heartfelt prayer hadn't just shifted something fundamental in Morgan's perspective of Sacred Heart. Her innocence, combined with the depth of her compassion, crystallized a decision that had been forming in his mind since his arrival. Father Thomas squeezed Morgan's shoulder once before releasing it, a knowing look in his eyes. They both recognized that Sarah's prayer had done more than just break the morning silence. It had illuminated the true spirit of Sacred Heart, the invisible threads that bound these children and their guardians together in a tapestry of mutual care and concern. As Sarah skipped past them toward the dining hall, Morgan found himself wondering how many other prayers these walls held, how many other children had poured their hearts out in this sacred space. More importantly, he wondered how he could answer Sarah's prayer, not just for Elijah but for all of them. The morning light continued to strengthen, casting long shadows through the chapel, as Morgan began to formulate a plan that would change not only his life, but the lives of everyone at Sacred Heart. In the dimming light of the orphanage's study room, Daniel sat hunched over his mathematics homework, though his mind wandered far from the equations before him. At 12, he carried burdens far beyond his years, ones that manifested in the deep furrows of his young brow and the way his shoulders seemed to bear an invisible weight. Morgan Freeman noticed the boy's distraction while passing by the open door. He'd observed Daniel's protective nature toward the younger children, particularly Sarah and Elijah, but something more troubled the youth today. What secrets lay behind those worried eyes? "Mind if I join you?" Morgan's gentle voice carried across the room. Daniel startled slightly, then straightened his posture, trying to appear more composed than he felt. The boy's attempted maturity touched Morgan deeply. How many children here felt compelled to grow up too quickly? "I'm just finishing my homework, sir," Daniel replied, his pencil tapping nervously against the desk. But Morgan had spent enough time around children to recognize deflection when he saw it. He pulled up a chair, careful to give Daniel enough space to not feel cornered. "You know, when I was about your age, I used to sit in this very room," Morgan shared, his eyes scanning the familiar walls. "Back then, I thought if I appeared busy enough, no one would notice how scared I was about what tomorrow might bring." Daniel's pencil stopped its nervous dance. His eyes met Morgan's for the first time that evening, a flash of recognition passing between them. "Did you hear about the funding?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question caught Morgan off guard. How had Daniel learned about the orphanage's financial struggles? But of course, children always knew more than adults gave them credit for. They were masters at picking up unspoken tensions, at reading between the lines of hushed conversations. "I overheard Miss Lorraine talking to Father Thomas," Daniel continued, the words now tumbling out. "They think they'll have to close the home by winter if things don't change. Where will everyone go? Sarah's still so young, and Elijah, he's finally starting to trust people again. I can't let them be separated." Morgan listened as Daniel revealed how he'd been secretly trying to help, doing extra chores to save Miss Lorraine money, attempting to fix broken items himself, even skipping meals occasionally so the younger children could have more. The boy's selfless dedication to protecting his makeshift family struck a chord deep within Morgan's heart. "Sometimes I pretend I'm already grown up," Daniel admitted, his voice thick with emotion, "that I can just get a job and take care of everyone myself. But then I remember I'm just a kid and nobody would listen to me anyway." Morgan leaned forward, his presence both commanding and comforting. "Who says nobody would listen? You've just told me something very important, something that took great courage to share. That's not the action of just a kid. That's the action of someone who truly cares about his family." The conversation shifted to Daniel's memories of his first days at the orphanage, how Miss Lorraine had helped him overcome his initial anger and fear. He spoke of watching new children arrive, each carrying their own wounds, and how he'd made it his mission to help them feel safe, just as others had done for him. "I see them all at night," Daniel explained, "when they think everyone's asleep. Sarah still cries sometimes, and Elijah writes in his journal until dawn. I want to fix everything for them, but I don't know how." Morgan recognized in Daniel's words the same helplessness he'd felt as a child, that desperate desire to protect others while feeling powerless to do so. But perhaps this boy's courage in speaking up could be the catalyst for change the orphanage needed. "What if I told you that by sharing this with me you've already started fixing things?" Morgan asked, watching hope flutter across Daniel's features. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit we need help. The question is, Daniel, will you help me help them?" The boys' response would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just the orphanage, but the lives of everyone within its walls. What began as a confession in a quiet study room would grow into something far more significant. But first, Daniel had to make a choice. The first rays of dawn crept through Morgan's hotel room window as he sat at the small desk, his phone in hand. After the previous evening's revelations from Daniel about the orphanage's uncertain future, sleep had proven elusive. How many times had he witnessed promising young lives derailed by circumstances beyond their control? The thought of Elijah, Sarah, and Daniel facing such uncertainty stirred something deep within him. Morgan dialed a familiar number, knowing his assistant would already be at her desk despite the early hour. "Janet, I need you to clear my schedule for the next 2 weeks," he began, his voice carrying the weight of purpose. "And get me everything you can find on St. Catherine's Home for Children. Financial records, property deeds, outstanding debts." Janet acknowledged his requests. Morgan's mind wandered to Miss Lorraine's tired eyes and Father Thomas's weathered face. These were people who had dedicated their lives to providing stability for children who had none. Now, they themselves needed support, though they were too proud to ask for it directly. "One more thing," Morgan continued. "Connect me with our foundation's legal team. I want to explore options for establishing an endowment." He paused, remembering Daniel's protective stance when speaking about Sarah and the younger children. "And Janet? See if you can track down any corporate sponsors who might be interested in supporting youth education programs." The wheels were already turning in his mind. This wasn't just about writing a check. It was about creating sustainable change. Morgan had learned long ago that true impact required careful planning and strategic thinking. His experiences in the entertainment industry had taught him the value of building networks and leveraging relationships for meaningful causes. His thoughts drifted to Elijah's journal, filled with stories that deserved to be heard. Perhaps there was a way to combine the boys' creative aspirations with the home's needs. Morgan made another call, this time to his publishing contacts. "Remember that youth writing program we discussed? I think I've found the perfect place to launch it." As the morning progressed, Morgan's hotel room transformed into an impromptu command center. Calls were made, emails exchanged, and plans began taking shape. He thought about his own childhood visits to St. Catherine's, how the place had sparked his imagination and shown him possibilities beyond his circumstances. Didn't today's children deserve the same opportunity? The response from his team was overwhelming. People he had worked with over the years immediately offered their support, suggesting various ways to help. A prominent architect volunteered to assess the building's structural needs. An educational foundation expressed interest in providing technology resources. Even his old friend from the theater world proposed organizing acting workshops for the children. Morgan's phone buzzed with a message from Miss Lorraine, asking if he would join them for breakfast. He smiled, knowing that soon he would have news that could change everything for St. Catherine's. But first, he needed to understand more about the immediate challenges they faced. He gathered his notes and prepared to head to the orphanage, his mind already racing with possibilities. How would Miss Lorraine react to his proposals? Would Father Thomas support his vision for the home's future? Most importantly, how could he ensure that children like Elijah, Sarah, and Daniel would have the resources they needed to pursue their dreams? As Morgan stepped out into the morning air, he realized that this project had become more than just a casual visit to his childhood haunts. It had evolved into a mission to preserve something precious, a place where children could find not just shelter, but opportunity. The question now wasn't whether he could help, but how to do it in a way that would honor the spirit of St. Catherine's while securing its future. His driver was waiting, ready to take him back to the orphanage. Morgan settled into the back seat, reviewing his morning's work. Sometimes, he mused, the most important roles we play aren't on any screen or stage, but in the quiet moments when we choose to step into someone else's story and help write a new chapter. Miss Lorraine Whitaker stood at her office window watching the children play in the courtyard below. Her weathered hands clutched a fresh cup of tea, the warmth seeping through the ceramic providing a small comfort against the morning chill. Through the glass, She observed Elijah sitting apart from the others, his journal balanced carefully, on his knees as his pencil moved across the page with practiced determination. The sight of Morgan Freeman's car pulling into the orphanage's driveway earlier that morning had stirred something within her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in quite some time. Could it be hope? After 23 years of caring for countless children, Miss Lorraine had learned to temper her expectations, but something about Morgan's presence felt different. She recalled her conversation with Father Thomas the previous evening, his eyes twinkling with recognition as he shared stories of a young Morgan Freeman visiting the orphanage decades ago. The boy had a fire in him, Father Thomas had said, the same fire I see in young Elijah's eyes when he writes in that journal of his. From her vantage point, Miss Lorraine noticed Sarah approaching Elijah, her small frame casting a shadow across his writing. The girl held out what appeared to be a cookie, likely saved from breakfast. After a moment's hesitation, Elijah accepted the offering, and Sarah settled beside him, content to share his quiet company. Daniel, ever the protective figure, watched from nearby while playing basketball with some other boys. The scene brought tears to Miss Lorraine's eyes as she remembered her first encounter with Elijah 3 years ago. The boy had arrived, clutching nothing but a tattered notebook, his eyes holding secrets too heavy for his young shoulders. How many nights had she spent worried about his reluctance to engage with others? How many prayers had she whispered for someone to reach through his carefully constructed walls? A knock at her office door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, quickly wiping away any trace of tears. Morgan Freeman entered, his presence filling the room with a quiet authority that reminded her of Father Thomas. "Miss Lorraine," he greeted her warmly. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." She gestured for him to take a seat, noting how his gaze drifted to the window and the children below. "Not at all, Mr. Freeman. I was just observing our little family." "Please call me Morgan," he insisted, his voice carrying that familiar gentle rumble that had already begun to work its magic on the children. "I've been making some calls this morning, and I believe I might have something that could benefit Elijah, and perhaps all the children here." Miss Lorraine leaned forward, her heart quickening. What could this man who had walked these very halls as a child have planned? She watched as Morgan pulled out his phone, showing her something that made her gasp softly. The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour, during which Miss Lorraine felt decades of careful restraint beginning. To crack Morgan's proposal was more than she could have hoped for. A chance not just for Elijah, but for all the children to explore their creative potential. "Of course, we'll need Father Thomas's blessing," Morgan added, his eyes crinkling with warmth, "and the children will have to want to participate. We can't force inspiration, but we can certainly nurture it." Miss Lorraine nodded, understanding perfectly. She thought of Sarah's quiet persistence in befriending Elijah, of Daniel's protective nature, of Father Thomas's unwavering faith in each child's potential. Perhaps Morgan's arrival was the catalyst they had all been waiting for. As they concluded their meeting, Miss Lorraine found herself standing at the window once more. Elijah had moved closer to the other children now, his journal still in hand, but his attention engaged with Sarah and Daniel's conversation. The sight filled her with a profound sense of possibility. "You know," Morgan said, joining her at the window, "sometimes all it takes is one person believing in you to change everything. I learned that right here in this building many years ago." Miss Lorraine turned to look at him, seeing both the successful man he'd become and echoes of the boy Father Thomas had described. "And now you're here to pass that belief forward?" Morgan's response was interrupted by the sound of children's laughter floating up from the courtyard. They both watched as Elijah, in a rare moment of abandon, joined Daniel in a game of basketball, his journal safely tucked away, but not forgotten. What changes would tomorrow bring? Miss Lorraine wondered. And more importantly, were they ready for them? As she observed Morgan's thoughtful expression, she realized that perhaps readiness wasn't what mattered most. Perhaps it was simply having the courage to embrace possibility when it presented itself. Father Thomas stood in the chapel's quiet sanctuary, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he gazed at the stained glass windows casting colorful shadows across the worn wooden pews. The morning light filtered through, creating a kaleidoscope of memories from his decades of service at St. Michael's Orphanage. How many children had he counseled in this very space? How many tears had he wiped away? How many prayers had he whispered? The soft creak of the chapel door announced Morgan Freeman's arrival, and Father Thomas turned to face the man who had once been one of those children seeking solace within these walls. The years between then and now seemed to dissolve as their eyes met, creating a bridge across time that connected the scared young boy Morgan had been to the accomplished man he'd become. "I remember when you used to slip in here during thunderstorms," Father Thomas said, his voice carrying the warmth of shared history. "You'd sit right there, third pew from the front, clutching your notebook just like Elijah does now." Morgan's expression softened at the mention of Elijah. "I see so much of myself in him, Father. The way he withdraws into his writing, using words as shields against the world. But there's something more there, something that needs nurturing." The priest nodded, understanding flowing between them. "Miss Lorraine told me about your offer to mentor him. She's cautiously optimistic, though her caution comes from years of seeing children's hopes raised and dashed." "I know that pain all too well," Morgan replied, his deep voice resonating in the chapel's acoustic space. "But sometimes the right person at the right moment can change everything. Someone did that for me, and now I have the chance to do the same for Elijah." Father Thomas moved closer, studying the man before him. "And what about Sarah and Daniel? They're part of Elijah's world now, inseparable in many ways. Have you considered how your presence might affect them?" The question hung in the air, important and weighty. Morgan had indeed noticed the protective way Daniel hovered near Sarah during their shared meals, how Elijah's rare smiles seemed to bloom most naturally in their presence. The three children had created their own family within these walls, bound by something stronger than blood. "They're all part of this story," Morgan acknowledged. "I've watched how they interact, how they support each other. Daniel's strength, Sarah's gentleness, Elijah's depth. They balance each other in ways that remind me of my own journey through darkness toward light." Father Thomas's eyes crinkled with approval. "You've observed more than most visitors do. Miss Lorraine believes your influence could extend beyond just Elijah, touching all the children here. But she's particularly concerned about these three." "Because they've already been hurt?" Morgan asked, though it wasn't really a question. He understood the delicate nature of trust in a place where abandonment was a shared wound. The priest moved toward the altar, his steps measured and thoughtful. "Because they've learned to hope despite being hurt. That's a rare and precious thing, Morgan. It needs to be protected as much as it needs to be nurtured." Morgan followed, drawn by the gravity of the moment. "I remember what it was like, Father. The constant fear that any happiness would be temporary, that any connection would eventually break. But I also remember the day someone showed me that some bonds can last forever, that some people choose to stay." Father Thomas turned to face him fully, his expression both serious and gentle. "And that's what you're choosing now? To stay?" "For as long as they need me," Morgan affirmed. "Not just Elijah, but all of them. These children deserve to know that their stories matter, that their voices deserve to be heard." The priest's face broke into a warm smile, years of concern melting away. "Then you have my blessing, Morgan. Not that you needed it. God's work often begins in the heart long before it receives official sanction. But what would this blessing mean for the children who had learned to survive on their own? How would Morgan's presence reshape the delicate ecosystem of relationships within St. Michael's walls? And most importantly, could one man's decision to stay really heal wounds that ran so deep? The morning light shifted, creating new patterns on the chapel floor, as if suggesting that change, while uncertain, could bring unexpected beauty. Father Thomas and Morgan stood together in that light. Two generations of St. Michael's children united in their determination to help write a new chapter in the ongoing story of hope and healing. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the orphanage's dining hall windows as Miss Lorraine methodically arranged chairs in a circle. Her movements, deliberate and precise, betrayed the nervous energy she felt about Morgan Freeman's impending announcement. Who could have predicted that a simple visit would evolve into something that could potentially change their small community forever? Father Thomas stood near the entrance, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, watching as children filtered into the room one by one. His eyes lingered on Elijah, who clutched his journal close to his chest as he entered alongside Sarah and Daniel. The priest noticed how Daniel's protective stance over his younger companions hadn't wavered since the day they'd arrived at the orphanage. Morgan Freeman's deep voice carried from the hallway as he approached, engaged in quiet conversation with one of the older children. The familiar sound drew Elijah's attention immediately, his grip on the journal loosening slightly. How had this man, in just a few days, managed to pierce through the walls that Elijah had so carefully constructed around himself? Miss Lorraine observed the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere as Morgan entered. The children, usually restless during mandatory gatherings, sat with unusual stillness, their eyes fixed on the distinguished visitor who had become such an integral part of their daily lives. Even Sarah, typically shy and reserved, seemed to lean forward in anticipation. "I believe everyone's here," Father Thomas announced, his voice gentle but carrying authority. He exchanged a knowing look with Morgan, who nodded in acknowledgement. The priest had witnessed many changes in this orphanage over the years, but something about today felt different. Transformative, perhaps. Morgan took his place at the head of the circle, his presence commanding yet comforting. The children's faces reflected various emotions: curiosity, hope, and perhaps a touch of anxiety about what was to come. Daniel instinctively moved closer to Sarah, while Elijah's fingers traced the spine of his journal, a habit he'd developed when processing intense emotions. Miss Lorraine settled into her chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though her fingers couldn't help but fidget with the fabric of her skirt. She'd dedicated years to these children, watching them grow, helping them heal, and now she sat among them, equally uncertain about what Morgan would say. Would his words bring the change she'd been praying for? Father Thomas positioned himself near the window, where he could observe both Morgan and the children's reactions. His memory drifted briefly to the young boy Morgan had once been, visiting this very orphanage decades ago. How fitting that life had brought him full circle, ready to impact another generation of children seeking direction and purpose. The room fell into complete silence as Morgan cleared his throat. Elijah's pen hovered over his journal, ready to capture whatever words might follow. Sarah's small hand found Daniel's, squeezing it gently, while Miss Lorraine held her breath, her years of experience telling her that this moment would be etched in their collective memory forever. What words would Morgan choose to share with these eager young minds? How would his announcement reshape their daily lives? The anticipation in the room was palpable, each person connected by invisible threads of hope and uncertainty, waiting for the first words that would begin the next chapter of their story together. Morgan's eyes swept across the room, meeting each gaze with warmth and understanding. He lingered briefly on Elijah, offering a subtle nod that seemed to carry a weight of meaning only they shared. The boy's shoulders relaxed slightly, his pen beginning to move across the page as if he already knew what was coming. Father Thomas watched as Morgan took a deep breath, preparing to speak. The priest's hands clasped together in an unconscious prayer, hoping that whatever was about to be said would bring the light of hope he'd always wished for these children. Would Morgan's words be the catalyst for the change they all sensed was coming? The afternoon light continued to shift, creating a golden glow that seemed to embrace the gathered group. In this moment of suspended animation, each person in the room felt connected by something larger than themselves, a shared destiny perhaps, or the simple power of being present for what they all somehow knew would be a pivotal moment in their lives. The late afternoon sun filtered through the orphanage's weathered windows as Morgan Freeman stood before the gathered crowd. His presence commanded attention, not through force but through the quiet dignity that seemed to emanate from his very being. The children sat cross-legged on the floor, their faces turned up toward him with a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. Miss Lorraine and Father Thomas occupied chairs near the back, their expressions reflecting years of shared hopes and disappointments for the children in their care. Morgan's eyes found Elijah's in the crowd, seeing in the boy's face the same yearning he had felt decades ago in this very room. How many dreams had been born and died within these walls? How many children had sat exactly where these young ones sat now, wondering if their turn for happiness would ever come? "I was once where you are," Morgan began, his rich voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Right here, in this building, wondering what tomorrow might bring." He paused, allowing his words to settle. Daniel unconsciously drew closer to Sarah, his protective instinct showing even in this moment of quiet attention. The story Morgan shared wasn't one of instant success or magical transformation. Instead, he spoke of small victories, of countless rejections that preceded each achievement, of the power of believing in oneself when it seemed no one else did. Miss Lorraine dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief as Morgan described the day a young teacher had given him his first book of poetry, awakening in him a love of words that would eventually help shape his future. Father Thomas nodded slowly as Morgan recounted the role of faith, not just in a higher power, but in the fundamental goodness of people. The priest remembered the young boy Morgan had been, always asking questions, always seeking understanding beyond his years. Now watching him speak to these children, Father Thomas saw the completion of a circle that had begun so many years ago. "But today isn't about my story," Morgan continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "It's about yours. Each of you has a story waiting to be written." Elijah clutched his journal tighter, feeling the weight of his own unwritten pages. "And that's why I'm here to announce something that I hope will help you write those stories." The children leaned forward unconsciously, drawn by the promise in his voice. Miss Lorraine's hands clasped tightly in her lap, her heart racing with hope for her charges. Morgan took a deep breath, understanding the magnitude of what he was about to share. "Starting today, we're establishing the Second Chance Foundation. This foundation will ensure that every child in this orphanage has access to education, arts programs, and mentorship opportunities." He paused, watching the impact of his words ripple through the room. "But more than that, we're creating a support system that will continue even after you leave these walls." Sarah's small hand found Daniel's, squeezing it tight. Morgan continued, outlining plans for college scholarships, vocational training, and ongoing support services. But beyond the practical details, he spoke of something more precious, the promise that none of them would have to face their futures alone. "Some of you might be wondering why I'm doing this," Morgan said, his voice softening. "The answer is simple. Because someone once showed me kindness when I needed it most. Sometimes that's all it takes. One person believing in you. One chance to prove what you're capable of." Elijah's hand moved across his journal, already forming the words he would write about this moment. Miss Lorraine watched him, seeing for the first time in months a spark of real hope in his eyes. Father Thomas silently offered a prayer of gratitude, recognizing the hand of Providence in bringing Morgan back to this place at exactly the right time. The speech continued, but it had transformed from a mere announcement into something more profound. A pledge, a promise, a bridge between past and future. As Morgan spoke of his vision for the foundation, he wove together threads of hope, determination, and possibility, creating a tapestry that showed these children a future they might never have imagined for themselves. What would this mean for each of them? How would their stories unfold now that this new chapter had begun? The answers lay ahead, waiting to be discovered, but for now, in this moment, something powerful had shifted in the atmosphere of the old orphanage. The air itself seemed charged with possibility, and in the faces of the children, one could see the first glimmers of dreams taking flight. Morgan Freeman stood before the gathered crowd in the orphanage's main hall, his presence commanding yet gentle as he unveiled the details of his vision. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting a warm glow across the faces of Miss Lorraine, Father Thomas, and the children, who had become far more than just residents of a struggling institution. "When I walked through these doors, weeks ago I thought I was here to fulfill a simple obligation," Morgan began, his rich voice carrying to every corner of the room. "But what I found was something far more precious, a family that refuses to be broken, children who deserve every chance at a bright future, and dedicated guardians who've given their lives to make that possible. Elijah sat between Sarah and Daniel, his journal clutched tightly to his chest. The past few weeks had transformed him from a quiet observer to someone who dared to hope, largely due to the man standing before them now. How many nights had he spent writing about the changes he witnessed, about the way Morgan's presence had sparked something new in all of them? Miss Lorraine dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief as Morgan outlined the establishment of the Freeman Foundation for Children's Futures. The foundation would not only ensure the orphanage's financial stability, but would create opportunities that had seemed impossible mere months ago. Educational programs, artistic workshops, and vocational training would become regular features of life at the home. But this isn't just about money, Morgan continued, his eyes meeting Father Thomas's knowing gaze. It's about creating a legacy of hope, a place where every child knows they matter, where their dreams aren't just wishful thinking, but achievable goals. Daniel's hand found Sarah's, as Morgan explained how the foundation would help older children, like himself, prepare for life beyond the orphanage walls. College scholarships, apprenticeship programs, and mentorship opportunities would ensure that no child would have to face the world alone once they aged out of the system. Father Thomas stepped forward, placing a weathered hand on Morgan's shoulder. "You were once one of these children," he reminded everyone, his voice thick with emotion. "And now you've become the answer to prayers we didn't even know how to voice." The plan included renovations to the aging building, but more importantly, it provided for additional staff to support Miss Lorraine, who had carried the weight of so many responsibilities alone for too long. Her dedication had kept the orphanage running through its darkest hours, and now she would have the resources to expand her vision of care and nurturing. "Miss Lorraine," Morgan addressed her directly, "your love has been the foundation of this home. Now it's time to build upon that foundation, to create something even more extraordinary." The children listened intently as Morgan described the immediate changes they would see: a library filled with books that would fuel their imaginations, a proper playground where they could simply be children, and regular visits from professionals who could inspire them to dream bigger than they ever thought possible. Elijah's hand moved across his journal, already composing the words he would write later. How could he capture this moment when everything changed? How could he describe the way hope felt as it filled the room, touching every heart present? The Freeman Foundation would partner with local businesses and educational institutions, creating a network of support that extended far beyond the orphanage walls. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about thriving, about giving each child the tools they needed to build their own futures. "But perhaps the most important thing we're creating here," Morgan said, his voice softening, "is a reminder that no one's past dictates their future, that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected places, and that family isn't always about blood. It's about belonging." Sarah leaned against Elijah's shoulder, and he could feel her trembling with excitement. Daniel's usual protective stance had relaxed, replaced by a look of wonder as he began to see his own future taking shape in Morgan's words. Miss Lorraine stepped forward, her voice steady despite her tears. "Mr. Freeman, you've given us more than security. You've given us a future we can believe in." The plan would take time to fully implement, but the immediate infusion of resources meant that the threat of closure was permanently lifted. The children would never again have to worry about being separated, about losing the only family many of them had ever known. Morgan concluded by announcing the formation of a board of trustees, with Father Thomas and Miss Lorraine serving as key members, ensuring that the orphanage's original mission of love and care would remain at the heart of all future decisions. As the details of the plan settled over the room, a new energy began to emerge. It wasn't just about saving an orphanage anymore. It was about creating a model for what such a home could be, about showing the world that every child deserves not just shelter and food, but the chance to become everything they dream of being. In Sansao, the quiet hours of a late autumn afternoon, Elijah Carter sat cross-legged on his bed, a fresh notebook open before him. The crisp pages seemed to whisper possibilities, so different from the tear-stained journal entries of months past. His fingers traced the smooth lines, remembering Morgan Freeman's words about how stories could change lives, not just the readers, but the writers too. Down the hall, Miss Lorraine watched through the partially open door, her heart swelling at the sight of Elijah's renewed interest in writing. The past few weeks had transformed the boy who once hid his words from the world. Morgan's presence had awakened something in Elijah that she had long hoped to nurture, but never quite knew how. Sarah and Daniel had taken to sitting near Elijah while he wrote, not disturbing him but offering silent companionship. Today, Sarah worked on her own story, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration while Daniel sketched in a notebook Morgan had given him. The three children had formed their own little creative circle, each inspired by the other's dedication. Father Thomas often found himself pausing during his daily rounds, listening to the scratch of pencils and the occasional whispered conversation between the children. He remembered a young Morgan Freeman sitting in those same spots, creating his own stories decades ago. How fitting that the cycle of inspiration had come full circle. Morgan's influence extended beyond just Elijah's renewed passion for writing. The other children in the orphanage had begun sharing their own stories during evening gatherings. Some told tales of imaginary adventures, while others bravely shared pieces of their real lives. Miss Lorraine noticed how these story sessions helped heal old wounds and build new bonds among the children. Elijah's latest story was different from his earlier works. Where once he wrote of loss and loneliness, his new pages spoke of hope and possibility. His characters faced challenges but found strength in unexpected friendships. The parallel to his own life wasn't lost on Miss Lorraine, who had watched his relationship with Morgan blossom from tentative trust to deep understanding. The boy's writing had taken on elements of Morgan's storytelling style, the way he built tension, developed characters, and wove themes of redemption throughout his narratives. But Elijah's voice remained uniquely his own, carrying an authenticity that touched everyone who read his words. Sarah had become Elijah's first reader, offering honest feedback with the directness only an 8-year-old could manage. Her insights often surprised the adults, showing wisdom beyond her years. Daniel, though less interested in writing himself, had become an enthusiastic audience member during story-sharing sessions, his questions helping Elijah refine his tales. Miss Lorraine began incorporating writing exercises into the children's daily activities inspired by Morgan's techniques. She watched as even the most reluctant children discovered their voices through words. The orphanage's atmosphere had shifted from one of quiet resignation to creative energy. Father Thomas noticed how Elijah's new story seemed to mirror the recent changes in their community. The boy wrote about a place where people came together to save something precious, much like Morgan's efforts to secure the orphanage's future. The priest wondered if Elijah understood just how much his own story had influenced others. Morgan's visits now included informal writing workshops, where he shared techniques and encouraged the children to experiment with different styles. He never corrected or criticized, instead asking questions that helped the young writers discover their own solutions. His approach empowered them to trust their instincts and value their unique perspectives. The transformation in Elijah extended beyond his writing. He smiled more, participated in group activities, and even helped younger children with their stories. Miss Lorraine sometimes caught him sitting with new arrivals, showing them how putting their feelings on paper could make them feel less alone. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the orphanage windows, Elijah continued writing. His pencil moved steadily across the page, adding life to characters who represented hope, courage, and the power of community. In his story, as in his life, the darkness of the past gave way to the promise of tomorrow. What would these young writers become? How many lives would their stories touch? The answers lay in the future, but the foundation was being built with each word they wrote, each tale they shared, and each moment they spent believing in the power of their own voices. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.